Hello, everybody, and welcome to my Crimson Vow draft guide. In this video, I will be giving you all of the information you need to crush your next Crimson Vow draft. But before I get started, I want to remind you that if you enjoy this video, be sure to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more draft content, and comment below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. Without further ado, let's get started. In this draft guide, I will be discussing the set mechanics. I will be going through the top 3 commons for each color. I will be giving archetype overviews. I will discuss the combat tricks, and then I will cover trap cards to avoid, combos to assemble, and more. Let's get started. The set mechanics in this set are Training, Cleave, Blood Tokens, Exploit, Day and Night, and Disturb. Let's get started with Training, which is a mechanic attached to creatures that say, whenever this creature attacks with another creature with greater power, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So with Apprentice Sharpshooter, if you attack with a creature that has more than 1 power, you will put a +1/+1 counter on the Sharpshooter, and then the next time you try to attack with a Sharpshooter, if you attack with a creature that has more than 2 power, you will put a +1/+1 counter on the Sharpshooter if it is also attacking. So it continues to scale through the game if you have creatures that are bigger than your training creatures, and it is going to help you grow your creatures with +1/+1 counters. Next up is Cleave, which is a mechanic that gives you an alternate cost to get an extra benefit on the card. So for example, with Fierce Retribution, it's 1 and a white to destroy target attacking creature, but if you're willing to pay 5 and a white, you can destroy target creature in general. So generally, the cheaper cost is going to be more niche or marginal, and the more expensive cost is going to give you a more powerful effect on your Cleave card. The next new mechanic is Blood Tokens, which is a token that has the ability 1 tap sacrifice to discard a card and draw a card. And if you do generate those blood tokens, there are also some other ways to sacrifice them for value other than just using them to filter your draws. An example of a card that generates a blood token is Gluttonous Guest, which is a 3-mana 1/4 that creates a blood token when it enters the battlefield and also gives you the extra benefit of gaining you a life whenever you sacrifice a blood token. The next mechanic is Exploit, which is a mechanic that when the creature enters the battlefield, you have the option to exploit a creature, which means that you sacrifice a creature. Now, it is important to note that you can sacrifice the exploit card to itself. And when you do exploit a creature, you get a benefit. So for example, with Diver's Scab, when it exploits a creature, target creature's owner puts it on the top or bottom of their library. Now, one final thing to note with Exploit is that if you are casting your exploit card and your opponent kills it with an instant speed removal spell in response, you will no longer get the benefit from the exploit if the creature is not in play. That is just something that's worth noting. You will get the benefit if you exploit the creature to itself, but if you exploit a different creature when the creature with the exploit ability is no longer in play, you will not get that benefit. So if you play Diver's Scab and they kill it in response, don't sacrifice your other creature to try and get the ability because it will not work. Next up is Day and Night, which is a mechanic that works with day-bound and night-bound cards. So when a card enters the battlefield, it will have day-bound, and the day-night cycle will start. It is going to be the same for both players, and it will be in effect for the rest of the game. It is daytime until a player passes the turn without casting a spell on their turn, and then it will be nighttime, and it will flip all of the day-bound cards into night-bound cards, and it will remain nighttime until a player casts 2 spells on their turn. So, and when they do that, it will become day at the beginning of the next turn. So, like an example of a card with this mechanic is Fearful Villager. When it enters the battlefield, it will become day, and then if at any point the active player doesn't cast a spell, it will become night and daybound, and Fearful Villager will become Fearsome Werewolf, and that will be a 4/3 menace, and then if at some point the active player casts 2 spells, it'll flip back to day. Fearful Villager will once again be in play instead of the Fearsome Werewolf. It's also important to note that if it is nighttime when you cast the Fearful Villager, it will enter play as the Fearsome Werewolf, so it'll enter on the nightbound side. So just worth noting. And then the final mechanic is Disturb, which is a mechanic that is attached to creatures and gives them a little bit of extra value. So for example, with Twinblade Geist, it is a 2-mana 1/1 double strike, and then it has Disturb for 2 and a white, which means that if it is in your graveyard, you can cast it for its Disturb cost, and it'll enter on the back side of the card as Twinblade Invocation, which will give an enchanted creature double strike. And then if the invocation would ever be put into a graveyard, you exile it instead, which is just to prevent you from casting the same aura over and over and over again. So it's a nice little way to get extra value from your creatures and provide you with some extra benefit if you do manage to mill them from other means or discard them with your blood tokens or things of that nature. Moving on to the top commons, we are starting things off with white, and at number 1 is Drogskull Infantry. which is a 2-mana 2/2, which is already solid stats, and then it also has Disturb for 3 and a white, which will give an enchanted creature +2/+2, which is a really nice buff for the mid game. Normally this sort of thing is not playable on its own, but when it's attached to a 2-mana 2/2 creature, it is quite nice to have access to that effect, and so Drogskull Infantry is number 1. At number 2 is Kindly Ancestor, a 3-mana 2/3 lifelink creature, which is already, again, a reasonable body, but it also has Disturb for 1 and a white, which will give enchanted creature lifelink, so you can put that onto a flyer to have that evasive lifelink, or put it onto a big creature to just gain a bunch of life in one swing, and overall, a 3-mana 2/3 with that extra upside is well worth it. And then at number 3 is Traveling Minister, a card that comes down early in the game and then helps you enable attacks, and also helps you trigger life gain synergies, and also just helps you win races by representing a 2-point life swing if you're able to deal that extra point of damage from the +1/+0 and also gain 1 life, and it only costs 1 mana for all of that benefit, which is why it slips in at number 3. Moving on to blue, at number 1 is Lantern Bearer, a 1-mana 1/1 flyer, which also has the Disturb ability for 2 and a blue to give an enchanted creature +1/+1 and flying. This is a card that plays very well with what blue is trying to do. It is a nice card to exploit, which means you can sacrifice it to your other exploit cards and not feel bad about it, because you're later then just going to be able to use the Disturb cost to buff up your creatures. And it's also just a nice little aggressive card that when it does die, it'll make one of your other creatures into a threat that has to be dealt with. So a great card to have early in the game, and it also works well with any self-mill or graveyard shenanigans you have going on. At number 2 is Binding Geist, another card with the Disturb mechanic, a 3-mana 3/1 that when it attacks makes a creature an opponent controls get -2/-0, which basically means that it cannot be just crushed by opponent having a 1/1 creature or something of that nature. And then when it does enter the graveyard for some reason, you can then disturb it to give enchanted creature -2/-0, which is kind of like a small removal spell, which is just very nice to have access to, and it's just going to be a premium 3-drop as a result. Also a card that you don't really mind exploiting, because that just means you'll be able to use that disturb part of the card. And then at number 3 is Steelclad Spirit. A 2-mana 3/3 is just great stats, though it does have some downside of not being able to attack. The fact that there are disturb cards that you're really hoping to play does mean that it will be able to attack some percentage of the time, and a lot of the time you just need more time in a blue deck to set up for your late game with where you're going to have card draw or value cards or things of that nature. And a 2-mana 3/3 really does do a good job of holding down the ground while you're trying to set up your late game. So that's why it comes in at number 3. Moving on to the black cards, at number 1 is Bleed Dry, which is 4 mana to give a creature -13/-13, which is basically just killing it, and then that creature will be exiled, which is a nice effect to have in a set where there are some graveyard shenanigans going on. And 4 mana at instant speed to kill a creature is just great. At number 2 is Gift of Fangs, which is kind of a complicated card to read, but basically is going to give a creature -2/-2, unless that creature is a vampire, in which case it'll give +2/+2. But usually you're going to want to be giving a creature the -2/-2, using this as a 1-mana removal spell to help stabilize you against the aggressive starts of your opponents. And then sometimes, if you have some vampires in your deck, you'll buff them up and swing for the win, or things of that nature. It is sometimes awkward that you want to kill a vampire with this, but you will be unable to do so. But most of the time, you'll be able to find a good target, and for only 1 mana, that's a pretty nice effect to have. And then at number 3 is Ragged Recluse, a card that plays very well with blood tokens, because at the beginning of your end step, if you discarded a card, you transform Ragged Recluse from a 2/1 into a 3/3 with a pretty powerful ability of making the defending player lose 1 life and you gain 1 life. So Ragged Recluse, a card that is going to be great to have access to if you have a lot of blood tokens, and even if you have only a few blood tokens, it's going to be worth including this card as a 2-drop with some pretty significant upside. So that's why it comes in at number 3. Moving on to the red cards, at number 1 is Abrade, a very efficient removal spell. 2 mana to deal 3 to a creature at instant speed is just very, very good, and a great effect to have access to. And the Destroy Target Artifact effect is also something that is going to come up from time to time, so nice little extra benefit tacked on to an already great card. At number 2 is Flame Blessed Bolt, a card that is also going to be very effective, killing small creatures from your opponents, and even exiling them, so if they do have some disturb shenanigans going on, you're going to be preventing that, which is quite nice, and a nice bit of upside on a card that is already solid. And then at number 3 is Blood Petal Celebrant. Again, a 2 mana 2/1 first strike attacker is very good, and then the fact that it creates a blood token when it dies is just additional gravy attached to it. So a nice little 2-drop creature for your aggressive decks, and even in a defensive deck, it's not that bad to just play this as a 2-drop, and then when it dies, you'll get a little bit of extra upside. Moving on to green, at number 1 is Spore Crawler, a creature that just gets you a 2-for-1 if you manage to trade it for a creature, which isn't going to be that hard to do because it does have reasonable stats as a 3-mana 3/2, and if you do want, you can also just sacrifice it to your exploit cards or things of that nature. So a nice little card at number 1 green common. At number 2 is Flourishing Hunter, a card that's just going to gain you a lot of life if you do manage to set it up properly and really stabilize you against aggressive decks. A lot of the time, 6-drop creatures are cards you can't afford to play multiples of, but if this card is in multiples, then you gain 6 life with the second copy of it, which is just very powerful, and one reason that you're able to prioritize Flourishing Hunter, because it just has such a tremendous impact on the game, and it's definitely a card that is going to be a great top-end finisher for your green decks. And then at number 3 is Weaver of Blossoms, a great card to use to ramp into your Flourishing Hunters and also fix your mana and cast any other expensive cards you're playing, and it is a werewolf, so if it does become nighttime at some point, it will tap for 2 mana of any color and get a bit of a stats boost as well. So Weaver of Blossoms, a great addition to your green decks, ramping you, fixing you, just doing things that green likes to do. Moving on to the color rankings, before I get into them, I want to say that it is important in draft to make sure that you are trying to find the open lane rather than just trying to force the colors that you think are best in a vacuum, because that way you're going to be getting the higher quality cards from the colors that are more open, and so you're going to end up with a better deck overall. But in this set, green is the best color. It just has great 2-drops, great 3-drops, just great cards up and down the curve. It's got good synergy with itself, and it just synergizes well with other colors as well. So green is at number 1. At number 2 is blue. Again, great synergy with itself, great value with its disturbed creatures. It's got some flyers, which are quite good to have in limited, and overall a very powerful color. At number 3 is black. It's got some pretty good removal spells. It's got some pretty good synergy creatures. It's got some pretty good themes that are relatively well supported, and so it comes in at number 3. And then towards the lower end of the color ratings is red, which has some very good cheap creatures and removal spells, but it does not have the depth of commons that some of the other colors have. And then at the lowest end of the ranking, in last place, is white, which just has some relatively weak cards after the top few commons, and also has some cards that are relatively narrow, or cards that you're not going to be able to play in a lot of archetypes. So maybe it just plays better as a support color, where the cards that it has are going to synergize with the other colors, but don't really form the basis for a deck on their own. So those are the color rankings. Moving on to the archetype overviews, starting with red-white. As a macro sense, this is an aggressive strategy that wants to curve out and then push through those final points of damage if your opponent does manage to establish some blockers. So it can use a card like Markov Waltzer to push through bonus damage by buffing whichever creatures need help getting through. Angelic Quartermaster doing a similar thing. And then Alluring Suitor is just a great card in a curve out deck because it starts out as a 3-mana 2/3, but if you curve 2-drop into Alluring Suitor into attack, you then not only get to make it into a 3/3 Trampler for 3 mana, which is already great rate, but you can also start buffing up your creatures, which is great, and you can even start ramping your other creatures out by maybe playing 2 3-drops after you've flipped your Deadly Dancer, because you'll have 6 mana if you are doing that on turn 4. So that's very, very powerful to have access to. Moving on to blue-black. In a macro sense, this is an exploit deck that just generates value from exploit cards, having fodder to sacrifice to exploit, and then having cards with the exploit mechanic themselves, and just generating a lot of value that way. So the card Skullscab is very reflective of this strategy. It gives you an extra benefit whenever you exploit. The card Biolume Egg is the perfect card to sacrifice to exploit because it's a 3-drop that, if you do manage to sacrifice it, becomes a 4/4, and a 3-mana 4/4 is just an incredible rate, especially when considering that you also got to use it to trigger one of your exploit cards. So pretty much the perfect card for this deck. And then Fellstinger is just a great card with the exploit mechanic that you can just use to get a lot of value. Moving on to green-white. In a macro sense, this is an aggressive humans strategy that has also got some +1/+1 counter synergies. So the card Sigardian Paladin is a human that also rewards you for having +1/+1 counters. Cloak Cadet is a card that can get you some extra value if you are generating +1/+1 counters onto your humans, which is often going to be the case because the cards with training are generally humans. And so that's going to be a nice way to get extra cards for your deck. And then Resistance Squad just pretty much says it on the card. It cares about you having humans, and curving 2-drop human into Resistance Squad is going to be a great curve out for your aggressive strategy. Moving on to blue-red. In a macro sense, this is a strategy that cares about casting non-creature spells and getting some benefit from that, and just playing a relatively mid-rangey role. So it's got the card Wandering Mind, which can get you some card selection and a nice 2-for-1 attached to a flyer. It's got the card Whispering Wizard, which, if unanswered, will enable you to assemble a spirit army that will take over the game. And then it's got a card like Lamhold Raconteur, which is going to start pinging your opponent out whenever you're casting spells while being a relatively sizable defensive body. And if it ever does flip, it's going to be pinging your opponent out very quickly by dealing 2 every time you cast a non-creature spell, and also being a relatively sizable attacker. So that is what blue-red is trying to do. Next up is green-black. In a macro sense, this is a strategy that just generally plays a mid-rangey game, but it also has a toughness matters theme. So it's got the card Ancient Lumberknot, which is going to make your creatures with more toughness than power deal damage equal to their toughness in combat rather than their power, which is just a really nice addition for cards like the Lumberknot, which then becomes a 4/4 instead of a 1/4. It's also got the card Catapult Fodder as a payoff for this strategy, which if you control 3 creatures with toughness greater than their power, it will flip into a Catapult Captain, which is a nice little stats boost. It becomes a 2/6 instead of a 1/5, but then it also gives you the ability to start sacrificing those high toughness creatures to not drain your opponent, but make them lose life to lose the game. So generally you can flip this, and then at some point on their end step, you can sacrifice a big toughness creature, untap, sacrifice another big toughness creature, and win the game with the Catapult Captain, from the Catapult Fodder. And then finally, there's a card like Dormant Grove, which is going to be growing your creatures as you've stalled the game out, hopefully. And then once you have a creature with toughness 6 or greater, you can transform it into the Gnarled Grove Strider, which is just a nice sizable creature that gives your other creatures extra ability in vigilance. So it's just going to help you start attacking. And if you are able to make the toughness matter, then you can even do something like make it into a 6/6 vigilance if you have the Ancient Lumberknot in play. So the tree folk are playing well together in that sense. Moving on to white-blue, in a macro sense, this is a deck that cares about having disturbed creatures and having some flyers. So it is worth noting that pretty much any white or blue deck is going to like the disturbed cards because they're just powerful cards, but white-blue gets some extra synergy in the form of something like Brine-Comber, which gives you an extra 1/1 flyer when it comes into play, and whenever you make it the target of an aura spell, so whenever you're casting the aura half of one of your disturbed cards and you target Brine-Comber, you get a little bit of extra value. And then it can also be Brine-Bound Gift, which is going to be giving that same ability to another creature, so it gives basically an incentive to put all of your auras onto the creature with the Brine-Bound Gift. You also have a card like Storm Chaser Drake that also works great in this strategy because not only is a 2-mana 2/1 flyer excellent, but it's also great to put auras on because putting your auras on your flyer means it's going to be hitting harder, and it also draws you a card whenever it becomes the target of a spell you control. And then if you are trying to race them in the air with your little flyers and your disturbed cards, Dawnheart Geist can do a lot of work if you are gaining 2 life every time you cast an enchantment, because whenever you cast an aura, gaining 2 life can be pretty powerful if your deck is constructed properly, or with a lot of the powerful cards that you want. Next up is red-green, which is a werewolves and wolves strategy. In a macro sense, it cares about curving out with wolves and werewolves and then eventually making it nighttime and flipping all of your wolves into devastating creatures. So one of the cards that is great for this sort of thing is Child of the Pack, which is a 4-mana 2/5, but it also has an activated ability of 2 red-green to create a 2/2 wolf creature token, which is a way to spend your mana to affect the board state, but also not casting a spell, which makes it easier to flip into night, where it becomes a Savage Packmate, which is a 5/5 trample that gives other creatures you control +1/+0. So that's a great way to flip it to nighttime and then get an extra benefit for that because you have generated that extra wolf token. You also have a card like Runebound Wolf, which is not a werewolf itself, but that does care about you having wolves and other werewolves, where it also gives you an activated ability where you can ping your opponent for a few points of damage, like maybe 2 or 3 points if you have enough wolves and werewolves in play, and then it will also flip into nighttime and be good for your other wolves and werewolves. So a great little addition to have on a 2-drop that has the right creature type as well. And then another card that cares about wolves and werewolves is Wolfkin Outcast, a card that can come down as a 4-mana 5/4 if you do have a wolf or werewolf, and if it becomes nighttime, it will make it so that whenever it or another wolf or werewolf you control dies, you draw a card, which is very powerful, and it also becomes a 6/5. So just a lot of stats and a lot of good synergy with your werewolves in red-green. Moving on to white-black, in a macro sense, this is a color combination that cares about gaining life and giving you some benefits for that. So a card like Markov Purifier, that whenever you gain life at your beginning of your end step, you can pay 2 and draw a card, is a very powerful piece to this sort of archetype where it's going to keep you churning through your deck and getting you a lot of value. You also have a card like Panicked Bystander, which not only gains you life whenever a creature you control dies, but you can also maybe flip it if you have some other life gain synergies into a Cackling Culprit, which is going to be a 3/5. And since you only paid 2 mana for the front side of the card, getting a 3/5 is huge. It maintains the trigger of gaining you life and also can gain Death Touch. And then at common, you get a really nice payoff in the form of Courier Bat, which is a way to return a creature from your graveyard to your hand if you have a way to gain life. So that's a nice little value card attached to a reasonably sized flyer, and that's a great way to get some value for your life gain at common. Moving on to blue-green, in a macro sense, this is a defensive strategy that tries to get value from the graveyard. So you can use a card like Vilespawn Spider to protect your life total by being a 2-mana 2/3 reach, while also filling your graveyard with its beginning of your upkeep Milla card trigger. and then eventually you can maybe sacrifice it to get a bunch of 1/1s if you so choose. There's also the card Bramble Worm, which is a great big way to stabilize the board by being a 7 mana 7/6 that gains you 5 life, and if you do happen to incidentally mill it, you do get to just exile it to gain 5 life from your graveyard, or you can do that after it's died and have gained a whopping 10 life. And you also gain access to a card like Cobbled Lancer, which is a 1 mana 3/3 if you have a creature card in your graveyard to exile when you're casting it. So if you're milling yourself, you're more likely to get there, and if you do mill the Cobbled Lancer, or when it dies, you can then exile it to get a little bit of extra value in that sense. So next up is Black-Red. In a macro sense, this is a deck that cares about blood tokens. It's another aggressive strategy, and then there are some vampire synergies as well. There's the card Blood Tithe Harvester, which is absolutely fantastic for this sort of deck, because not only is it a 2 mana 3/2, which is just a fantastic attacker, but it also generates you a blood token, and it also lets you cash it in for a removal spell in the late game if you need to, so just a fantastic card for this strategy. You also gain access to Wedding Security, which is a more expensive card for an aggressive deck, but it lets you turn all of your blood tokens into an actual card instead of just using them to discard a card and draw a card. So you're getting real card advantage from your blood tokens while also growing your Wedding Security. And then you also have a card like Blood Hypnotist, which will help you push through damage past your opponent's blockers by sacrificing your blood tokens, and it's especially powerful if you're sacrificing your blood tokens to something like Wedding Security, because then you're actually getting to use the blood tokens for more than just the discard draw effect, and making it hard for your opponents to block at the same time in your aggressive strategy. So red-black is really going to be utilizing the blood mechanic, and also really utilizing vampires and aggression. Moving on to the combat tricks that you need to be aware of in this set. There's a little bit less in Crimson Vow than there have been in some recent sets. In white, we have Adamant Will and Valorous Stance. Adamant Will gives +2/+2 in Indestructible, and Valorous Stance gives Indestructible. It's worth noting that Valorous Stance is also just a good card because it has the removal aspect of it as well, but knowing that there are 2 different cards that can give Indestructible in this set is worth knowing. And so that's what white has access to in the combat trick section. Blue has access to Cradle of Safety, which can give temporary hexproof to protect from removal spells, and it can also give +1/+1 if you want that to win a combat. And then there's also Serpentine Ambush, but because that card is not particularly powerful, historically this sort of effect has been poor, and so you can expect to play against that card less than normal because that card just itself isn't very good. In red, there's only 1 combat trick, which is relatively uncommon. Oftentimes red gets multiple combat tricks, but here they only have Sure Strike, which is a very good combat trick, +3/+0, and First Strike means it's going to do what combat tricks do. It's going to win you combat when you cast it, but it does still suffer from the downside that all of these combat tricks suffer from, which is it exposes you to a 2-for-1 if your opponent does have removal or interaction. But Sure Strike is a pretty good combat trick. And then green has access to 2 combat tricks, Massive Might and Witch's Web. Massive Might gives +2/+2 and Trample for 1 mana, and Witch's Web gives +3/+3 and Reach, and untap it for 2 mana. So those are both worth knowing about, especially because the Trample can potentially end the game out of nowhere if you are just trying to chump your opponent's big creature, and then the fact that your opponent can maybe untap their creature and get a surprise block off is something that's worth knowing as well. Moving on to some cards that are traps. First up is Supernatural Rescue. This card is just too expensive for its effect. The fact that it doesn't always have flash means that it's going to be really awkward to use sometimes, and just overall, even though it's got some versatility, it's just too expensive and too clunky for being worth it. Next is Dread Fugue, a card that just is going to miss way too much to be a card that you can afford to cast in limited, because sometimes your opponent's just not going to have a 2-drop. It means that you relatively, basically can't always cast it without paying the cleave, and paying 3 mana to make them discard a card, even if you do get to choose which card that is just too much mana to pay for this sort of effect, especially because when you do draw it in the late game when you're both top decking, it's not going to be able to do anything anyway. Next up is Into the Night, a card that's just too expensive for the effect, and it's especially bad because you don't really need this sort of hand smoothing or filtering in a set that has blood tokens already, where you're going to be able to discard the cards that you don't want with your blood tokens, so you don't really need Into the Night to get that effect, and you're not going to want to pay 4 mana for it especially. And then finally is Vampire's Kiss, a card that has a lot of text on it, but generally doesn't do enough to justify being worth a full card. Even if you do want blood tokens, it's best to find them elsewhere, because making them lose 2 and you gain 2 is just not really an effective use for a card, especially when you have to pay 2 mana for it. Next up are some combos that you can assemble in this set. The first one is Sigarda's Imprisonment and Alchemist's Retrieval. Essentially, you can put the trigger on the stack of Exile Enchanted Creature, and then use your Alchemist Retrieval to return your Sigarda's Imprisonment to your hand. So if you have 6 mana, you can exile your opponent's creature and get back your Sigarda's Imprisonment, so you basically get to cash in your Alchemist Retrieval for another copy of your removal spell. The next combo is between Bloody Betrayal and any exploit card. I used Mind Leech Ghoul as a placeholder because it's a cheap exploit card, so you can use this combo for only 5 mana then. but essentially you steal your opponent's creature and sacrifice it. It's a combo that comes up a lot, but in this case, you can actually use it in red-black or red-blue because blue and black both have sacrifice outlets in the form of exploit. So you're going to want to make sure that you have enough ways to sacrifice a creature before you're willing to play Bloody Betrayal, but it can actually be pretty powerful when you are doing it. Next up is Toxic Scorpion plus Ballista Watcher, which is a combo where you give the Ballista Watcher Death Touch, and then you use the ping effect to kill a creature of any size because the Ballista Watcher has Death Touch, so when it does any damage, you're going to kill any sized creature. And if you have Ballista Wielder, you can even ping 2 things if you have enough mana and kill 2 different creatures. And another final thing to note with Toxic Scorpion is it does combo pretty well with Massive Might, where if you give your creature Death Touch and then you also give it Trample with Massive Might, the creature only has to deal 1 damage to the creature blocking it, and then it can trample over the rest. So if you have a 6/6 and you give it Death Touch, you can then attack your opponent. If they block with, say, a 3/3 and a 3/3 and a 4/4 or something of that nature, or let's just say that they block with 2 3/3s, you then play Massive Might and your creature becomes an 8/8. You not only win the combat, but you also trample over for 6 points of damage because you are able to deal 1 damage to each of the opponent creatures and then trample over for the rest. And then the final combo, which is pretty involved but also pretty cool, is between Repository Scab and Undying Malice. Essentially, you play Repository Scab with the exploit trigger on the stack. You play Undying Malice, targeting your Repository Scab. Then the Undying Malice goes to the graveyard. Your Repository Scab trigger resolves. It sacrifices itself. You return Undying Malice to your hand, and Repository Scab enters the battlefield tapped. And the trigger once again goes onto the stack, and Undying Malice is back into your hand. So that's all well and good. You have generated a 5-mana 4/4 creature, and you have Undying Malice in your hand, but it is tapped. But if you then continue doing that loop, you can continue casting Undying Malice on your Repository Scab, continue sacrificing the Repository Scab to its own trigger. You can generate as many spell triggers as you want, so if you have cards that care about you casting non-creature spells, if you have cards that care about creatures entering your graveyard, or things of that nature, you can pretty much loop this for however much mana you have. So if you have 8 mana, you can do this loop you can do it for one time for every time you can cast Undying Malice. So you can do it like 4 times or something of that nature, which is really perfect if you have the card Skull Scab in play, because then every time you sacrifice a non-token creature, which does include the Repository Scab, you're going to be able to generate a 2/2 zombie creature token. So it's a pretty cool combo to know about, because if you are playing a blue-black deck, it's something that's really sweet that you can actually have a relatively decent chance of assembling. Moving on to the mana fixing in this set, Evolving Wilds is back, which is a really powerful land to have access to. It just makes your mana more consistent, and it also opens up some nice splash opportunities if you are able to get some cards that are worth splashing. There's also Honored Heirloom, which is an artifact that can tap for mana of any color, and it also gives you some incidental graveyard hate. And there's also Foreboding Statue at uncommon, which can tap for mana of any color, and it eventually flips into Forsaken Thresher, which is a big creature, a 5/5, and since you only paid 3 mana initially, it's a pretty nice addition to your deck if you do care about ramping or fixing your mana. In green, there are a few ways to fix your mana. There is Weaver of Blossoms, which we already discussed, which does flip into the Blossom-clad Werewolf. And then there is also Reclusive Taxidermist at the 2-drop slot, which can tap for a mana of any color, and then also can grow into a 4/4 in the mid to late game, which is quite powerful. And then finally, there's Nature's Embrace, which can be enchanting on a land to help that land tap for 2 mana of any color, which can fix your mana and ramp you. But in the late game, when you don't need fixing or ramp, it will be able to cash itself in almost to be an aura on one of your creatures, which is a nice little backup plan for a card that sometimes loses its relevance in the late game. Moving on to some final tips for the format, it is important to remember that cheap spells are especially useful for double spelling to make it day again. There are some pretty scary werewolves in the set, and if they do flip, it can sometimes be hard to make it daytime once again by casting 2 spells on your turn, and so that means that having some cheap spells in your deck is important so that you don't just get run over by werewolves. Another thing that's worth noting is it's important to make sure your decks have some sort of game plan so you can maximize synergy. There are a lot of cards that work better if your deck is geared toward doing one thing in specific, or having something like if your deck has a lot of blood tokens, having cards that care about those blood tokens, or if your deck has a lot of things that involve the graveyard, having cards that help you fill your graveyard. These are the sort of synergies that turn your good decks into great ones and help you get more wins in the format. Anyway, that is going to do it for this draft guide. I really do hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy it, remember to hit that thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel for more draft content, and comment below with your questions, thoughts, and feedback. And if you did make it all the way to the end of this video, leave hashtag ReadyWedding, because, you know, Red Wedding, Ready Wedding, it's a fun little pun to end the video. Anyway, that is going to do it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will talk to you next time.